The Galactic Combat Academy stood at the heart of the Orion system, a fortress of steel and glass, where the finest warriors from every known species were trained in the art of war. The arena, an enormous circular coliseum, was filled with spectators from across the galaxy, their voices blending into a deafening hum of excitement. Warriors, military officials, and nobles alike had gathered to witness a spectacle that had never occurred before. A human, unenhanced by cybernetics or genetic modifications, would face the elite fighters of the Academy in an endurance challenge. His objective? Survive for 3 minutes. It was a joke, a farce, something to entertain the crowd before the real matches began. No one had any doubt about how it would end. Lieutenant Daniel Carter stood in the center of the arena, his boots pressing into the hard metallic floor that had seen thousands of battles before him. He was unarmed, wearing only a standard combat uniform without any reinforced plating or shielding. His face was unreadable, his sharp blue eyes scanning the battlefield, assessing every possible angle, every potential threat. Unlike the aliens surrounding him, he lacked claws, fangs, bioarmor, or the ability to regenerate limbs. To the audience, he was fragile. To himself, he was ready. His opponents stood in a half-circle before him, each representing a different deadly species. The first, towering over the rest, was a Brockar, a monstrous being with dark, chitinous plating covering his entire body like a natural suit of armor. He had 4 thick arms, each ending in claws sharp enough to slice through reinforced steel. His face was hidden behind an insectoid exoskeleton, but Daniel knew he was already grinning, savoring the chance to tear him apart. To the left of the Brockar was a Yathari, a sleek, silver-skinned humanoid with eyes like black voids. His kind possessed the ability to phase in and out of reality for short bursts, making them nearly impossible to hit. His movements were smooth, deliberate, every step calculated. Next was a Varkol, a reptilian warrior whose species was known for their brute strength. His muscular frame was covered in thick, scaly skin, his hands tipped with serrated talons. He was the least intelligent of the group, but intelligence wasn't what made him dangerous. It was his raw, unrelenting aggression. Beside the Varkol was a Kereth, a species that looked almost human at first glance. But Daniel knew better. His enemy's pale lavender skin shimmered under the artificial lights, and his elongated fingers twitched with anticipation. The Kereth were infamous for their speed, moving faster than most could react. He had likely already planned the first 10 strikes he would deliver once the fight began. The final opponent, standing at the far right, was an Otakari, a creature with elongated limbs, double-jointed knees, and a head that resembled a bird of prey. His kind were natural hunters, relying on patience and keen reflexes to strike when their target least expected it. His sharp, narrow eyes fixated on Daniel, watching for any sign of weakness. The announcer's voice boomed across the arena, listing each fighter's name, achievements, and combat records. When he reached Daniel, there was a pause. Lieutenant Daniel Carter, human. No recorded victories in interspecies combat. No enhancements. No cybernetic augmentations. No armor. No weapons. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Daniel ignored them. He had nothing to prove to them. His focus was on the battle, on the challenge ahead. He rolled his shoulders, flexed his fingers, and exhaled slowly. The timer was set. 3 minutes. The horn sounded. Silence fell for a fraction of a second before the ground trembled beneath the Brackar's charge. The massive 4-armed warrior moved with surprising speed for his size, his claws raised high, ready to tear Daniel apart in one brutal swing. The crowd roared, already tasting the blood that was about to be spilled. But Daniel was already moving. He didn't step back, he didn't dodge blindly. Instead, he shifted his weight, angling his body just enough to let the Brackar's attack miss him by inches. The claws slashed through empty air, cutting deep into the ground where he had stood a heartbeat ago. The force of the strike left the Brakar momentarily unbalanced, his lower right arm dropping just slightly, just enough for Daniel to drive his elbow into the joint, forcing the arm to bend at an unnatural angle. The Brakar roared in pain, but Daniel was already pivoting, using the momentum to evade the Varkal, who lunged forward, his talons slashing toward his throat. Instead of retreating, Daniel stepped forward, ducking under the attack and twisting his body to deliver a sharp strike to the side of the Varkal's knee. It wasn't enough to break it, but it was enough to make him stagger. The Kareth was next, striking with the speed of a serpent, his elongated fingers aimed directly at Daniel's ribs. But Daniel had anticipated it. Instead of blocking, he sidestepped, allowing the Kareth's own momentum to carry him forward. In a flash, Daniel grabbed the alien's wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing into the Brakar, who was still recovering from the first attack. The crowd gasped. Daniel had done in seconds what no one had expected. He had thrown 3 of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy off balance before they could even land a proper hit. But he wasn't finished. The Uthari phased in and out of sight, teleporting behind him, attempting to drive a blade-like appendage through his back. Daniel didn't turn. He didn't need to. He had counted the movement, tracked the slight displacement of air, listened to the faint distortion caused by the shift in reality. At the last possible moment, he dropped to the ground, rolled forward, and kicked off against the metallic floor. The Uthari's blade missed by millimeters, striking empty space. Daniel landed in a crouch, exhaled, and smirked. 30 seconds had passed. The crowd, once laughing, was now silent. The warriors, once confident, now hesitated. Daniel knew what they were thinking. Humans were supposed to be weak. They were supposed to be slow, predictable, easy prey. But what none of them had understood, what they had failed to realize, was that humans didn't fight like other species. They adapted. And this fight had only just begun. Daniel remained in his crouched position, his muscles coiled like a spring, his mind processing every movement around him. The arena was no longer filled with the laughter and mockery that had greeted him when he first entered. Instead, silence settled over the crowd, broken only by the heavy breaths of the warriors he faced. His opponents, once arrogant in their superiority, now hesitated. He had taken them off guard. But hesitation would not last long. They were elite warriors, trained in countless battles, and they would adapt. That was the real danger. His eyes flicked to the Brakar first. The massive, four-armed creature had taken the brunt of his earlier maneuver, his lowest right arm hanging awkwardly at his side. Daniel had struck the joint hard, but he hadn't disabled it completely. That was a problem. Brakars had redundant muscle structures, allowing them to compensate for injuries faster than most species. Already, Daniel could see the warrior shifting his weight, redistributing his balance to account for the damage. The next time he attacked, he would be smarter. The Uthari, standing a few feet away, was unreadable. His void-like eyes reflected nothing, his silver skin shimmering slightly under the artificial lights. He had phased once already, but now he remained still, watching. That was what concerned Daniel most. Uthari were known for their analytical nature. This one was waiting, observing, adjusting his tactics based on what he had seen. The moment Daniel made a mistake, the Uthari would be there to exploit it. The Varkal paced to his left, his thick, muscular tail twitching with barely contained aggression. His breathing had deepened, nostrils flaring as he locked onto Daniel. Unlike the others, he would not wait. He was not built for patience. His kind thrived on overwhelming force. If he attacked now, it would be an all-out assault, and if Daniel miscalculated even once, it would end in an instant. The Kareth was the hardest to track. He stood motionless, his violet skin blending slightly with the background as if he were becoming part of the environment. He was not a brute like the Varkal, nor was he an observer like the Uthari. He was a predator, one that knew how to strike when his prey was distracted. His body was lean, his movements barely perceptible, but Daniel saw the way his fingers flexed, his weight shifting ever so slightly. He was preparing for something. The Otakari was another matter entirely. His elongated limbs and bird-like posture made him an entirely different kind of opponent. His kind specialized in ambush tactics, attacking from unexpected angles, striking before an enemy even realized he was in danger. His head tilted slightly, golden eyes narrowing as he observed the battlefield. He was waiting for the perfect moment, like a hawk circling above its prey. Daniel inhaled deeply, his mind piecing together every variable, every strength and weakness he had observed in those first 30 seconds. He would not last 3 minutes if he reacted to their attacks one by one. He needed to control the flow of battle, dictate the pace before they could overwhelm him. The Varkle attacked first, as Daniel had predicted. With a guttural snarl, he lunged forward, his talons aimed directly at Daniel's chest. The move was predictable, but the sheer force behind it was not something Daniel could afford to meet head-on. Instead, he shifted at the last second, angling his body just enough to let the claws slice past him harmlessly. The moment the Varkle's feet hit the ground, Daniel struck, driving his elbow into the reptilian's exposed ribs. The Varkle barely flinched. Daniel had expected that. His opponent's thick scales absorbed most of the impact, but he hadn't aimed for damage. He had aimed for positioning. The strike had forced the Varkle to stumble sideways, directly into the Brakar's path. The four-armed behemoth had been preparing his own attack, but now his momentum carried him forward at the wrong angle. He twisted at the last second, avoiding a full collision with the Varkar, but the brief distraction was enough. Daniel moved. Before the Ithari could react, before the Kerth could vanish into the background, before the Otekari could launch his ambush, Daniel seized the opportunity. He sprinted toward the Brakar, using his smaller size to duck under the alien's raised arms. In a single motion he leapt, grabbing onto the lowest of the Brakar's upper limbs and swinging himself upward. The move caught the Brakar off guard, and for a brief moment Daniel was perched on his opponent's broad shoulders. The Ithari reacted instantly, phasing out of sight, but Daniel had already anticipated it. Instead of attacking, he kicked off from the Brakar's shoulders, launching himself backward just as the Ithari phased back in, his blade-like appendage slicing through empty air where Daniel had been. The move worked, but it cost him. His landing was rough, his feet barely finding balance before he rolled into a crouch. The Otekari saw his chance. With unnatural speed, he lunged, his elongated limbs allowing him to strike from an impossible distance. Daniel barely managed to twist in time, the sharp talons slashing past his arm instead of sinking into his side. Pain flared where the claws had grazed him, but he ignored it. Pain was information, nothing more. He spun, using his momentum to bring his heel up in a sharp arc. The Otekari reacted fast, but not fast enough. The kick connected with his wrist, forcing him to pull back before he could strike again. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy Daniel a fraction of a second, and in this fight, a fraction of a second was everything. He exhaled sharply, repositioning himself as his opponents regrouped. The Brakar rolled his shoulders, the Ithari narrowed his void-like eyes, the Varkal bared his fangs, and the Kuretith, who had remained eerily silent, tilted his head, watching. Daniel knew what they were thinking. The moment he had stepped into this arena, they had seen him as weak, as slow, as nothing more than a lesser being thrown into a fight he had no hope of winning. Now they were no longer certain. Now they saw him as a problem. He had forced them to adapt, to change their approach. That was both good and bad. It meant they respected his ability to fight, but it also meant they would no longer be reckless. The advantage of surprise was gone. The real fight was about to begin. The moment of hesitation was gone. His opponents had regrouped, their initial arrogance replaced by cold calculation. The crowd sensed the shift in atmosphere, murmurs rippling through the stands as spectators leaned forward, eager to see how the fight would unfold now that the real battle had begun. Daniel adjusted his stance, his muscles tensed, his breathing steady. He had forced his opponents to acknowledge him as a threat, but that meant they would no longer hold back. The Brakar moved first, his massive form launching forward with a speed that should have been impossible for something his size. Daniel had anticipated an attack, but not this level of acceleration. He barely managed to twist out of the way, feeling the rush of air as one of the Brakar's lower arms swiped just inches from his ribs. Before he could regain his footing, the Varkar was on him, striking low with his clawed foot in an attempt to sweep his legs out from under him. Daniel reacted on instinct, throwing himself backward into a roll. He barely avoided the attack, but as he came up, he realized his mistake. The Ithari had already anticipated his movement. The silver-skinned warrior phased in right in front of him, his blade-like arm lashing forward in a precise, lethal strike. Daniel had no time to dodge. Instead, he twisted at the last second, letting the attack glance off his shoulder rather than sink into his chest. Pain flared, but he didn't slow down. Before the Ithari could press his advantage, Daniel retaliated. He pivoted, driving his elbow into the alien's ribs with enough force to make him stumble. The moment was brief, but it was enough. Daniel surged forward, striking again before the Ithari could phase out. His fist connected with the alien's jaw, sending him staggering backward. The Kertith seized the opening. Moving like a wraith, he darted in, his fingers reaching for Daniel's throat. Daniel barely had time to react. He ducked, but the Kertith adjusted mid-mateman, slamming his knee into Daniel's stomach. The impact stole Daniel's breath, forcing him back a step. The Kertith pressed his advantage, his movements fluid, precise. Daniel couldn't afford to be on the defensive. As the Kertith lunged for him again, Daniel caught his wrist, using the alien's own momentum to pivot and throw him off balance. The Kertith was fast, but Daniel had learned something crucial. His opponent relied on fluidity, on momentum. If Daniel disrupted that, he could control the fight. Before the Kertith could recover, Daniel drove his knee into his side, sending him sprawling. He didn't waste time celebrating. The Otek carry had been waiting, watching, and now he struck. His elongated limbs allowed him to attack from an impossible distance, his talons slicing through the air toward Daniel's neck. Daniel ducked, barely avoiding decapitation. He felt the razor-sharp tips graze his skin, but he didn't let it distract him. Instead, he dropped low, sweeping his leg in a wide arc. The Otakari leapt back just in time, avoiding the trip, but Daniel had already anticipated the reaction. He launched himself forward, driving his shoulder into the alien's midsection. The Otakari stumbled, but his kind were hunters, built for quick recoveries. He twisted in midair, landing with unnatural grace. Daniel knew he couldn't let him regain control of the fight. He pressed forward, striking with a rapid series of punches. The Otakari deflected most of them with his forearms, but one managed to connect with his jaw, snapping his head to the side. The crowd erupted in gasps. This was no longer a one-sided battle. Daniel was holding his own, forcing his opponents to rethink their approach. But he knew he couldn't celebrate yet. The Brakar had recovered, and he was angry. The massive warrior roared, charging forward with renewed fury. Daniel knew he couldn't block a direct attack, not from something that strong. Instead, he sidestepped at the last second, allowing the Brakar's momentum to carry him forward. But the alien had anticipated that. One of his lower arms lashed out mid-charge, catching Daniel across the ribs. Pain exploded through Daniel's side as he was sent sprawling across the arena floor. He rolled with the impact, coming up to one knee, his breath ragged. He didn't have time to assess the damage. The Varkal was already moving in for the kill. Daniel forced himself up, gritting his teeth against the pain. The Varkal's claws slashed toward his throat, but Daniel ducked, using the momentum of his movement to drive his fist into the alien's knee. The Varkal snarled, stumbling, but didn't go down. Daniel knew he was running out of time. He was outnumbered, outmatched in raw strength, but he still had an advantage. His opponents had trained against predictable combatants, warriors who followed patterns, who relied on brute force or specialized techniques. Daniel was neither. He was human, and that meant he was unpredictable. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to ignore the pain. His mind raced, analyzing his enemies, searching for the next opening. He had to be faster, smarter. He had to finish this before they adjusted again. The fight wasn't over. Not yet. But Daniel steadied himself, his breath controlled despite the ache radiating through his ribs. His opponents had regrouped, their initial arrogance replaced with sharp, calculating focus. He had done something they weren't expecting. He had survived. But survival wasn't enough. If he stayed on the defensive, they would adjust, and the fight would shift in their favor again. He needed to do more than react. He needed to take control. The Brocker cracked his knuckles, his thick, chitinous plating shifting with the movement. His wounded lower arm hung slightly looser than before, but it wasn't enough to slow him down. The Varker crouched low, his tail flicking from side to side, signaling that he was waiting for the right moment to strike. The Ithari had backed off slightly, his void-like eyes locked onto Daniel, scanning for weaknesses. The Querith remained eerily still, his head tilted slightly, as if calculating his next move. The Otakari perched on the edge of the battle zone, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his golden eyes watching every twitch of Daniel's muscles. Daniel knew he couldn't keep fighting on their terms. He had been reacting, countering, surviving, but now he needed to force them to move the way he wanted. If they dictated the pace, he would eventually make a mistake. He needed to make them believe they had control, only to rip it away at the last moment. He took a slow step backward, letting the motion look like an unconscious retreat. The Brocker noticed first. Daniel saw the slight shift in weight, the way his legs tensed, preparing for another charge. He wanted Daniel to run, to panic. That was exactly what Daniel wanted him to think. The Brocker moved, his massive frame hurtling forward, arms wide to block any attempt to dodge. Daniel held his ground until the last possible second. Just as the Brocker's upper right fist came crashing down, Daniel twisted sideways, barely avoiding the blow. The impact shattered the ground where he had stood, sending debris flying. Daniel didn't retreat. Instead, he surged forward, using the Brocker's momentary imbalance to his advantage. He drove his fist into the alien's already injured lower arm, targeting the weakened joint. The Brocker bellowed in pain, his left hand snapping forward in an attempt to grab Daniel, but Daniel was already moving. He ducked low, sliding beneath the massive warrior's guard and rolling to safety before the Brocker could recover. The Varkal took his chance, lunging with his claws extended. Daniel anticipated the attack but didn't dodge immediately. Instead, he feigned hesitation, letting the Varkal believe he had an opening. The reptilian warrior lunged fully, overcommitting to the strike. That was the mistake Daniel had been waiting for. At the last possible second, he dropped onto his back, letting the Varkal's momentum carry him forward. As the alien's talons slashed through empty air, Daniel kicked upward with all his strength, driving his boot into the Varkal's exposed stomach. The impact sent the warrior flying backward, crashing into the Brocker, who had just begun to recover. The crowd roared at the display, and for the first time, Daniel saw something flicker across his opponent's faces. Frustration. Good. He needed them frustrated. He needed them to stop thinking rationally. The Ithari phased out of sight. That was expected. Daniel didn't turn to track him. He knew the moment he did, the Querith would strike. Instead, he focused on his breathing, listening for the subtle distortion of air, waiting for the moment the Ithari reappeared. The phase shift created a barely perceptible energy fluctuation, one that Daniel had started to notice during the fight. There, he twisted just as the Ithari phased back into reality behind him, slashing with his razor-edged arm. Instead of dodging, Daniel caught the alien's wrist mid-swing. The Ithari's black eyes widened in shock. No one had ever timed the phase before. Daniel used the moment of surprise to twist his opponent's arm at an unnatural angle, forcing the Ithari to stumble forward. With a sharp elbow to the side of the head, Daniel sent him sprawling. The Keradith finally moved. His attack was silent, swift, and precise. Daniel barely had time to react as the alien struck, his fingers reaching for Daniel's throat. Daniel blocked, but the Keradith was faster than expected, adjusting mid-major and slamming his knee into Daniel's ribs. The pain was immediate and sharp, but Daniel refused to let it slow him down. Instead of pulling away, he did the opposite. He stepped in closer. The Keradith hadn't expected that. His kind fought by maintaining distance, by using speed to control the engagement. By closing the gap, Daniel took away that advantage. He drove his head forward, smashing it against the Careth's nose. The alien reeled back, momentarily dazed. Daniel seized the opportunity, grabbing the Careth's wrist and yanking him off balance. He spun, using the alien's momentum to send him careening toward the Brockar, who had just recovered from his earlier stumble. The two collided in a tangled mess of limbs. The Otakari had remained on the edges of the battle, watching, waiting. Daniel turned to face him, his breathing steady despite the pain radiating through his side. The Otakari tilted his head slightly, as if reassessing the situation. Then he moved. Daniel barely had time to react as the alien launched himself forward, his talons aimed directly at Daniel's chest. Instead of retreating, Daniel stepped into the attack, raising his arm at the last second. The Otakari's claws slashed through his sleeve, drawing blood, but Daniel had positioned himself perfectly. He grabbed the alien's wrist, twisted sharply, and drove his knee into the Otakari's ribs. The impact forced the alien back, but he didn't fall. He recovered instantly, his golden eyes narrowing. Daniel knew he wouldn't get another easy opening. The Otakari was a strategist, someone who waited for the right moment to strike. Daniel exhaled, rolling his shoulders. His opponents were still standing, but he had forced them to adjust, to fight differently than they had planned. He had taken away their confidence, their certainty. Now they were fighting on his terms, and he wasn't finished yet. Daniel's breath was steady despite the sharp ache radiating through his ribs. He had drawn blood, but so had his opponents. They had underestimated him at the start. Now they hesitated, recalculating every move, reevaluating every assumption they had made about the human who had dared step into their arena. But hesitation in combat was as deadly as any weapon. Daniel had no intention of letting them recover. The Brockar clenched his massive fists, his chitinous armor shifting as he adjusted his stance. The damage Daniel had inflicted on his lower arm still lingered, a weakness that hadn't gone unnoticed. The Varkar bared his fangs, his reptilian muscles coiled like a spring waiting for an opening. The Ithari was more cautious now, his silver skin flickering slightly as he calculated the timing for his next phase shift. The Kirtith, despite his sharp reflexes, had taken a hit that still left him dazed. And the Otek Harare, the most unpredictable of them all, crouched low, his golden eyes fixed on Daniel with a newfound respect. The seconds stretched. The crowd, once roaring with mockery, now held their breath. The battle wasn't supposed to go this way. A human was not supposed to be standing, let alone dictating the pace of the fight. But Daniel had been raised in a different kind of battlefield. One where war was not fought with brute strength, but with intelligence, adaptability, and deception. He exhaled, then he moved. Instead of waiting for them to attack, he closed the distance himself. The Brockar was the largest, the strongest, the slowest. If he fell first, the others would crumble. Daniel darted forward, aiming low, feinting toward the warrior's injured limb. The Brockar instinctively shifted his weight to compensate, expecting a strike. But Daniel had no intention of repeating a predictable move. At the last second, he pivoted, redirecting his momentum to launch upward. His fist crashed into the Brackar's jaw with the force of his entire body behind it. The impact sent a sickening crack through the arena. The Brackar stumbled. Not far, not much, but enough. Daniel didn't stop. He twisted in midair, using the rebound from his strike to spin and drive his knee directly into the alien's exposed throat. Chitinous armor protected most of his body, but no species could train their throat to take an impact like that. The Brackar's forearm shot up instinctively to grasp his neck as he reeled backward. He didn't fall, but he was out of the fight, gasping for air as his body struggled to recover. One down. The Varkal reacted immediately, lunging with a snarl. But Daniel was ready. He had studied the reptilian's movements, learned how he relied on overwhelming force rather than precision. The moment the Varkal leapt, Daniel shifted sideways. Instead of dodging completely, he struck at the alien's extended knee. The attack wasn't meant to break it, it was meant to disrupt balance. The Varkal crashed hard, his massive claws scraping the ground as he barely caught himself before rolling. Daniel didn't give him a chance to stand. He planted his foot against the Varkal's head and drove it downward with all his strength. The impact left the warrior dazed, his body twitching as he struggled to regain focus. 2 down. The Yuthari phased out of sight. Daniel didn't need to see him to know what was coming. He had been tracking the faint distortions the alien left behind every time he shifted between dimensions. The phase shift lasted less than a second, but Daniel had been counting the pattern in his mind. 1, 2, 3. Daniel struck the moment the Yuthari phased back in. His fist connected with the alien's temple before he had even fully materialized. The impact sent him spinning, his body collapsing as he tried and failed to phase again. His concentration was broken. He crumpled to the ground, his limbs twitching. 3 down. The Careth moved next. Unlike the others, he was precise, methodical. He didn't waste movements. His violet skin shimmered as he lunged forward, aiming not for Daniel's body, but for his throat. Daniel barely managed to block, feeling the sting of the alien's clawed fingers scraping against his skin. The Careth pressed forward, forcing him back with a relentless barrage of precise, rapid strikes. Daniel knew he couldn't keep up with that kind of speed. He had to end it quickly. He waited for the right moment. Then he made a mistake. At least, that's what it looked like. He let the Careth's next attack slip through his guard, allowing the alien's fingers to close around his throat. The Careth's grip tightened instantly, his victory all but certain. That was when Daniel struck. Instead of fighting against the hold, he surged forward, using the Careth's own grip as leverage. His forehead crashed into the alien's nose with a brutal headbutt. The Careth gasped, his grip loosening just enough for Daniel to wrench himself free. Before his opponent could react, Daniel grabbed the back of his head and drove his knee into his face. The Careth collapsed, unconscious, before he hit the ground. 4 down. The Otekari was the last. He had remained still, watching everything unfold. Now, for the first time, his stance shifted. He exhaled slowly, lowering his hands. Daniel stayed ready, but the attack never came. Instead, the Otekari nodded. Not in defeat, not in submission, but in understanding. He had seen enough. The fight was over. The arena was silent. The audience, the warriors, even the announcers, everyone stood frozen, staring at the human who had done the impossible. Then the silence shattered. A roar of cheers erupted through the Colosseum, voices shouting in disbelief, in admiration, in something that had never been given to a human before. Respect. Daniel exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he surveyed the battlefield. His opponents were down, but not dead. He had never needed to kill them. He had only needed to prove that he could. The announcer's voice finally returned, shaky but loud. "Lieutenant Daniel Carter, winner," the words echoed through the arena. Winner. Daniel straightened, glancing at the Brakar, who was still rubbing his bruised throat. The massive warrior met his gaze, then gave a small, grudging nod. The Varkal, barely conscious, let out a low, amused growl. The Yuthari, recovering, simply sat back, watching in stunned silence. Daniel had done more than win. He had changed the way the galaxy saw humanity. He turned and walked toward the exit, the cheers still roaring in his ears. 3 minutes? It had taken him less than 30 seconds.